Hi, last time we were together, we talked about the importance of law as a way of understanding the relationship of God to health and human health. And we said that this was a metaphor by which the Adventists, particularly in the years of consolidation after 1903, understood how they were to work with work with health and with healing. It started earlier, and we'll look at that today, but it really flourished in the years of consolidation. We also said that when the Adventists were disappointed in the earlier years, in the 19th century, um, that they saw some surcease, some renewal by looking at what was around them in space and seeing that this was God's creation and that He was present there at the time that they were so disappointed with the absence of God in the event that they thought was going to happen. Now, one of the ways in which this exploration of how the understanding of law and creation could be relied upon was in the work of John Harvey Kellogg. John Harvey Kellogg, at the age of 24, came to what had been called the Western Health Reform Institute, and it had two buildings, 50 patients. It had been established, interestingly enough, by James White, saying that though founded, this is an actual quote, though founded and managed by Seventh-day Adventists, it is not conducted on a denominational basis. Sectarianism is carefully avoided. Now that's interesting because later that kind of language is something that John Harvey Kellogg uses, not just James White, his mentor, but he uses and he gets criticized for it. The first director of the Western Health Reform Institute was a vice president, an Adventist, who was a vice president of the National Health Reform Association. So that this Western Health Reform Institute was very self-consciously a part of health reform that we saw exemplified by Sylvester Graham, and which the early Adventist leaders found out about and adopted when, about 20 years after the Great Disappointment, their health broke down and they went to an institution that was fashioned and run according to the principles of Sylvester Graham and health reform. Now, the interesting thing about the arrival of John Harvey Kellogg was that the Whites had very self-consciously, and I think we've mentioned this before, sent John Harvey Kellogg off, first of all, to a health reform institution. But then after that, they sent him to the best the best medical school in the country that was teaching the principles of regular medicine. And so when he came back to Battle Creek as a kind of second generation Adventist, 24, he was steeped in both health reform and also in regular medicine, what passed at that time for scientific medicine. It really was medicine that hadn't yet been introduced to the germ theory, asepsis, anesthesia, and the great dawn of the merger of science with medicine. But it was, quote, regular medicine. When he came, he renamed the place very soon. He called it the Battle Creek Medical and Surgical Sanitarium. And by 1888, he came in 76. By 1888, a little over a decade later, there was a four-story building, a five-story building in addition to that. And he had also, if you notice, used the word sanitarium, Battle Creek Medical and Surgical Sanitarium. Now, he's credited for having coined that term. Now, the genius of John Harvey Kellogg was to not dismiss the health reform, which had been movement, which had been fostered in America, as we've seen, by preachers to some extent. But he also felt that in addition to that, we should have the benefits of scientific medicine. He called this combination biologic living. And this was the term that was used particularly for the kind of health reform that goes under the heading of hydrotherapy. And he was famous and infamous in some circles for relying on water so much. But it was really an emphasis within this movement of health reform and living according to the principles of cleanliness, fresh air, exercise, good diet. But John Harvey Kellogg also was convinced that he needed to learn how to be a surgeon. And so he visited various centers in this country and overseas and became conversant with how to perform surgery and actually developed something of a national reputation, according to his biographers, as an abdominal surgeon. So here we go. This is a person steeped on both sides in his training, health reform, regular medicine, and he establishes at Battle Creek that he's not only going to use hydrotherapy, but he's also going to perform surgery. And there was a Johns Hopkins surgeon who is quoted as saying that Kellogg could perform the most beautiful human needlework he had ever seen. Now, that's at least one account of his ability as a surgeon. Now, in this period of the 1880s, 1890s, John Harvey Kellogg had some tension with the ministers of the church. And it was a natural sort of tension that emerged. First of all, he was better educated. He'd spent more years than they had in school. He had gone to a very good school, as it was known at that time, Oberlin College. We've mentioned that. And then he'd gone off to the University of Michigan and to Bellevue Medical School in New York City. So he thought that he was better educated than the ministers. They thought that he felt that he was better educated. But he had so much energy that he started quickly expanding his ideas as to what healthcare should be, this combination that I've talked about, that he created an association where all of these institutions could come together. It was called the International Medical Missionary and Benevolent Association. International Medical Missionary and Benevolent Association. And by the 1890s, this organization had more employees than the whole Seventh-day Adventist Church had. And he was very much the head of that. And he made certain that this crown jewel of Battle Creek Sanitarium, and then it had also developed an American Medical College in the 1890s, that this was held by this benevolent Medical Missionary and Benevolent Association, of which he was the head. Well, Ellen White helped a reorganization of the church in 1901. And at that time, independent boards were brought into the structure of the church and under the control of the General Conference in a way that they had never done before. John Harvey Kellogg was very suspicious of this. He felt that this was going to be a way to take away the autonomy of these health institutions. And so he fought this centralization, even though Ellen White was for it. In 1903, A.G. Daniels, and that's the division that I provide between the earlier period of ferment and the second period of consolidation, that's the time when A.G. Daniels was officially recognized as the president of the denomination, the person who had been the point man for Ellen White in consolidating these boards into the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Well, Kellogg was, despite the financial turbulence in America, particularly in the 1890s, he kept expanding and he kept expecting money to be provided for these new health institutions that he was beginning to build not only in the United States, but overseas. But the new General Conference administration was worried about the finances, and so they said, well, they were not going to continue to put money into these hospitals. John Harvey Kellogg, who had already started writing extensively in health, particularly this combination of health and spirituality, and had been very successful in those. He decided that he would produce a book called The Living Temple, and it would raise funds, and so he could go ahead and finance the medical institutions on his own. Well, that book came under criticism for theological reasons. There are no doubt other reasons, but he was accused of being a pantheist. A lot of people today think that he wasn't a pantheist, but that was the kind of accusation that was going on. They also discovered around this time, the church did, that there was language that had been used in the reincorporation of the Battle Creek Sanitarium that said that it was undenominational, unsectarian, humanitarian, and philanthropic in nature. Well, Kellogg had a good reason to think that this wasn't all that different from what he discovered as being the words used by James White to describe the Western Health Reform Institution. But that language was also a part of the tension between Kellogg and the Adventist Church. Well, by 1905 or so, Kellogg and the church stopped really having conversations. In 1907, unfortunately, John Harvey Kellogg was fellowshipped by the Battle Creek Church, Adventist Church. Now, Kellogg retained control of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, the medical school, and although he didn't control the Kellogg breakfast food industry, his brother did. The General Conference retained control of the SDA Church, and it was not being dominated by John Harvey Kellogg. A comparison of this might be that if you had the Marriott family, that is a famous Mormon family that has a huge chain of hotels, if you were to have a split between the Marriott family and the Mormon church, the Marriotts would keep their hotels, and the Mormon hierarchy would keep the Mormon church. Now, happily for the Mormons, that hasn't happened. So in a church where there's tithing and a stress placed on tithing, the Marriotts are great financial supporters of the Mormon church. You can imagine what would have happened if the Kelloggs had remained as happy members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and they were to continue to provide at least a tithe to the church. It would have been like the Marriotts in the Mormon church, but there was this split. Now, I go into all of this tension because it has created a pall for many decades on the relationship between health institutions and the Seventh-day Adventist central administration. And there has always been the fear that the health message would be retained by the Adventist Church, and they would encourage people to live according to those principles, but the health institutions would be very independent from the church. What I want to emphasize is that when that split came, there was never an attack by the church on the basic fundamental approach of Kellogg or the church on the question of law, particularly health laws. Both the church and John Harvey Kellogg continued to believe that there was not a uniformity, but a meshing of faith and reason. The split between Kellogg and the Adventist Church was not fundamentally a split between faith and for the Adventist Church, and then reason for John Harvey Kellogg. No, they both believed in it. In fact, John Harvey Kellogg thought that he was an Adventist till the day he died. Both Kellogg and the SDA Church believed that health was a part of God's creation. We, with our healthy bodies, are a part of the creation which God has brought into existence. And, as we've seen before, healing is a way of bringing human beings back into conformity with God's creation and with a creation that is ordered by laws. And these laws we heard last time included the laws of all kinds of laws, natural laws, laws of being, laws of health. So that understanding of Kellogg and of the church held. Now let me illustrate how that did hold. When the church split this way, it would have been possible for the church to say, well, you know what? This man he's a great man, but he has this strange idea that every Adventist should be a vegetarian. And he really did believe that. Every Adventist should be a vegetarian. Now, that's a little extreme. He takes the idea that the creation is somehow God's presence immanent in everything in creation. And they could have pulled back and said, you know what we're going to do? We're not going to be exploring all of these things. We're going to use the money that we have to build larger and more representative, that would be the word, representative churches in major centers of the United States. We're going to spend it in missions rather than in health. And in missions, we're going to spend it on evangelism. All right? But the fact is that the Seventh-day Adventist Church redoubled its efforts in the face of the split with John Harvey Kellogg to expand the efforts of Adventists in health, particularly in healthcare institutions. All right? So the split was started in 1903, and then it continued into the early part of the 20th century when Kellogg was disfellowshipped in 1907. In 1903, and from then to 1906, just 3 years, the church established new sanitariums, and they kept using John Harvey Kellogg's term, new sanitariums. Where? Well, just outside of Washington, D.C., and that's around the time, of course, 1903, when the church moved its headquarters from Battle Creek and moved it to Washington, D.C. And what did they do? They established the Washington Sanitarium. That is a place where even presidents went to, secretaries of state. It reestablished the whole idea of Battle Creek, where people could come and live healthfully and restore themselves for a week, several weeks, months. And that happened outside of Washington, D.C. on a part of property that's a little higher than Washington, D.C. itself. Same period, 1903, 1906, when the church was trying to recover from this split, they established a hospital that's still there in Hinsdale, Illinois. They established one outside of Madison, Wisconsin. They established one in Melrose, Massachusetts. Bang, 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 bang. They established these hospitals. And all of these carried the basic philosophy that both the Kelloggs and the church had together, which was, okay, we're going to believe in miracles, we're going to believe in faith, but we're also going to believe that God works through laws, right? And so this wasn't enough. Around this same time, 1905 to 1906, Ellen White, who was in her late 70s, she was 78 years old when this began, she gets very involved with trying to encourage the building up of medical institutions in Southern California. The population of America was continuing to go west. She had helped to move the church into Northern California, helping to establish Pacific Press in Northern California, and a sanitarium in the north. Now she was really concerned about Southern California. And she visited Southern California many times. She was aware of the fact that there are only about 1,100. When we say 1,100, there was that seemed like a lot to them, but 1,100 members now. The Loma Linda University Church is about 5,000 to 6,000 members. And the church members and the entities that organized the church, the Adventists in Southern California, they were $40,000 in debt. And this was a time where the church was concerned, remember, in its split with John Harvey Kellogg, being overextended with debt. And it was a time they'd just come out of a recession or a depression even, the last years of the 19th century. But Ellen White made contact with a business person named John Burden. There are people here at Loma Linda who remember seeing John Burden. He lived a long life like a lot of these Adventist leaders did. They lived good, healthy lives. And she got in touch with him, and she used him as an agent to look at property. Because of the poor economic times at the end of the 19th century, the 1890s, 1880s, 1890s, and a boom out here originally, people wanting to come out to California, there had been established quite a few hotels. And these hotels were places that were understood to be in healthy locales in Southern California, and people were expected to come and restore their health, just as they had gone to Battle Creek to do that. And what she realized, she was a very shrewd person, and her husband had been an entrepreneur starting magazines, let's face it, helped to establish the structure of the Adventist Church. She realized that these hotels were in good condition, and they had, many of them, gone bankrupt. And so they were available for much less than one would expect. She went further than that. She started picking out places so that she emphasized with Burden that they should buy a place in Paradise Valley in San Diego, and also one of these hotels in Glendale. And sure enough, very quickly, those sites were bought and were established. Then she said, look, we have to have a sanitarium in the area around Riverside and Redlands, where there are all these marvelous orchards of oranges. And she kept talking, Riverside, Redlands. And she even then got specifically and said, look, we need to go and find something in Redlands. Well, that specific emphasis on Redlands was 1905. And lo and behold, people found something called the Mound City Hotel. And what they did was to find that it was available for $110,000. Well, $110,000, that's, it may have been a bargain, but it was a lot more than these people who were $40,000 in debt could afford. But Ellen White kept pushing Burden. And he would write to her and say, well, there's this possibility, that possibility, talk to the brethren. And she actually wrote back to him one of these times and said, I've just received your letter, and I am not going to talk to the brethren. By all means, go out and arrange for this to be bought. Well, he didn't know whether she was going to be able to pay for it or not, but she had supreme confidence in her ability to produce books that would sell, and the proceeds of that would be available then to help these medical institutions flourish. Now, remember, this is very closely after the break with John Harvey Kellogg. And it's just, I think, very clear that she realized that if health was going to be a part of the Adventist mission, the Adventists needed to move quickly so that they would not be discouraged by what had happened with John Harvey Kellogg. And she really felt, I think, a competition with John Harvey Kellogg, who by the time of the split had already become a national figure. So it's a long story of high drama, and if you get a hold of the book, The Vision Bold, there's a marvelous blow-by-blow account of how Ellen White encouraged John Burden to create a group. They worked very, very hard to raise money. There were deadlines that they had to meet. Yes, we are going to pay the $45,000, but we will pay you $1,000 by May 29, $4,000 more by June 15 of the same day. They managed to somehow get that together. Then there's $5,000 more by July, and $5,000 after that in August, and so on. And there are stories of amazing events where people who have just sold some property and know Ellen White, and they're very happy to hand over the money that they received one day to Burden the next. There's also, some of you know about the Los Angeles Times, which is still the dominant newspaper. Well, there was a Colonel Otis who came from the South after the Civil War and established the LA Times here, and his daughter contributed what was a large amount of money at that time, $10,000, to help establish these medical institutions in Southern California. So it was one amazing event after another by these very devout people who stepped out as entrepreneurs and believed that the Lord helped them. And all the time, Ellen White, how do we put this? Ellen White was the spirit moving in addition to the law of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But she was doing it in the name of the law of being, or the law of health, which she felt this church needed to continue to serve. And so you have, during this very time that John Harvey Kellogg is not being talked to in 1905, and by 1907 he is disfellowshipped, in 1906 already, the Loma Linda College of Evangelists is open. They not only have a sanitarium, which has very few people, but they have a building, but they start a Loma Linda College of Evangelists. Now, nobody quite knew what that was and what they were to produce there, but they opened it. And it started off with a program in nursing. And here at this university, Loma Linda University, woe betide anybody that thinks that it's the medical school that was the first school here at Loma Linda. No, it was the nursing school and then the medical school. So this was an amazing activity that was going on. Now, why do I go into all of this? Because I want to show the continuity between the 19th century and the 20th century in the idea that the Adventists have that health is something that is connected with law. And it became very, how do I say this? Became very dramatically tested when the people who had done all of this in the name of the Adventist Church, but particularly of Ellen White and her insistence that something happened, the question came, all right, we're saying this is a medical educational institution. Now, is it going to be like the one that John Harvey Kellogg had, where he was combining healthcare reform and how you live according to the laws of nature with modern medicine? And he even established a school of medicine, and the graduates received accreditation, and he wanted them to receive accreditation. He encouraged them to receive accreditation. And people weren't sure whether this thing that had just been started, the Loma Linda College of Evangelists, was going to be something like the old health reform institutions that John Harvey Kellogg had first gone to, and E.J. Wagner had gone to, or was it going to be like Bellevue that John Harvey Kellogg had gone to, and that E.J. Wagner had gone to with the support of the Adventists, which was regular medicine? Was this institution going to not only study the laws of nature, but was it going to conform to the laws or standards of the professions for what was real medicine? And so I want to focus on a question and an answer that was addressed to Ellen White, and she was by this time 82 years old. 82 years old. And they're still going to her for wisdom, right? What should we do, and what are you suggesting that we do? So the question was this: did you mean that Loma Linda should be a sort of Bible school where treatment of simple diseases took place, along with missionary work? Or, quote, did you mean a fully equipped medical school that teaches the Bible and the truth, but that gives such thorough training along medical lines as will qualify the students who take the course to pass state board examinations and become registered qualified physicians for public work? Now, they finally, by 1910, and this place had opened in 1906, they wanted to know which direction we're going to go. Because if it's the latter, that is a huge and ambitious thing to do, right? Well, here came the answer from 82-year-old Ellen G. White. We must provide that which is essential to qualify our youth who desire to be physicians, so that they may intelligently fit themselves to be able to stand the examinations required to prove their efficiency as physicians. So you got examinations. State board. She'd been asked about state board examinations. The medical school at Loma Linda is to be of the highest order. Okay. For the special preparation of those of our youth who have clear convictions of their duty to obtain a medical education, listen to this, to obtain a medical education that will enable them to pass the examinations required by law of all who practice as regularly qualified physicians. We are to supply whatever may be required. Okay, so we are to train people who will get a medical education that enables them to pass the examinations required by law of all who practice as regular qualified physicians. The whole history of Adventist education was settled right here. Not immediately, but this is where it was settled. Why? Because not only did we believe in the laws of nature, and these were also the laws of God, and these were also the laws of health, but we believed in the laws of society that regulated a healthy society. And she took that basic assumption and translated it into this practical question. Now, what that meant was that Adventists training to be physicians had to learn about God's creation. And that was not just in science, but it was going to be generally true in other fields, and I'll indicate just in a second why that was. This was a Rubicon in Adventism. And the medical school immediately conformed to that. Now, if you can imagine, this is 1910. The year the medical school opened, and the reason that they were so puzzled as to what they should do in 1906. The school opened in 1906. What are we going to do? Because right at that time, there was a historic move made by physicians, the American Medical Association. They got a report written by a man named Flexner. And Flexner said, here are the standards that medical institutions have to have. Sorry. And he started naming the schools that didn't qualify. And he closed down most of the medical schools that existed in that time in America. It was also the time when scientific medicine was coming in more and more. And this Flexner report was an attempt to make sure that American medical schools were based on science. So you can imagine when the Adventists are starting this, what Loma Linda College of Evangelists, are we supposed to conform to the Flexner report or not? And she says, yes. Now, 4 years afterwards, 4 years after the Flexner report. Well, one way to look at the drama of medical education, and I said that was that's the main focus of our talk together today, is that we have been committed to common definitions of what are laws. Laws in nature, laws in professions, and what that means is that Seventh-day Adventists are a part of society. And we are going to accept the obligations of institutions in American society. Not only that, we're going to accept the fact that the assumption on the part of educational institutions in this country that the human mind and the human reason can understand God's creation and the laws that they find there, the regular flow of cause and effect in science, in human activity, in society. We're going to agree with a lot of other people in the society that one can read what those are, can read off of that and understand what those laws are. Now, one of the ironies of this is that in 1906, the year we began our medical school, and by 1910 we were committed to making it a real medical school, the American Medical Missionary College that Kellogg had started in Battle Creek was closed. And it's really sad. If you come to the grounds of Loma Linda University, there is an area that emphasizes the history of Loma Linda University. And there is a big boulder, and that has been taken from the grounds of the American Medical Missionary College, which was in Battle Creek as a part of the Adventist Center of Medical Institutions in Battle Creek. Some of those people on that faculty came to the College of Medical Evangelists here, as it came to be called. And it's a symbol of the continuity between what the Adventists worked so hard to establish in Battle Creek, and which was, and at least the college was closed in 1906. The Battle Creek Sanitarium continued and flourished, actually. But the college was closed, and then it was continued out here. Now, one of the main symbols of whether we are agreeing with the society's understanding of law is accreditation of our schools. And in 1915, this is just 9 years after the Flexner report came out, 9 years after we had become established, 5 years after receiving the advice from Ellen White in 1910, the Adventists received their rating from the American Medical Association. What was it? C. Worthless. C. Now, that could have been an occasion to sort of say, you know, we ought to rethink this business. Is this our role, really, to put all this effort into conforming to society's understanding of what is good medicine? Should we put our efforts, finally, after all of these attempts, into evangelism, into missionary work overseas? First, you know, very simple kind of maybe relief work, first aid work, clinical work. Not a bit of it. The Adventists redoubled their efforts. And so, from 1915 to 1922, they worked very hard. And in 7 years, they got an A rating from the American Medical Association. An A rating. And ever since then, they have worked very hard to maintain their standing and their accreditation. But that wasn't all. This understanding that Ellen White gave when she was asked, we are to conform to the standards of society and their understanding of what is good education, had an enormous impact on all of Adventist colleges. First in the United States, where they were first established, and then now overseas. Why? Well, as the medical profession looked at its own standards and they wanted to improve the kind of medical care that was being given, they wanted to emphasize that people should really be studying God's creation. And some of them believed it was God, some not, but we believed it was God's creation. And that was so important that they said not only must the schools of medicine have certain high standards, and we're going to keep after them. And yes, you Adventists in 1922, you got an A-rated medical school. But we are saying that if you're going to maintain an accreditation, you have to admit people to your school who are graduates of accredited colleges. Now, it was always a commitment that the Adventists wanted to give preference to Adventists who graduated from Adventist colleges to the medical school. After all, it was still being called the College of Medical Evangelists, and so it had a role within the church, the right arm of the message, etc. But now, the issue was, is the Adventist church, in order to make sure that the medical school is accredited, going to go out and conform to the standards of good education that regional accrediting bodies that are kind of quasi-governmental, they're recognized by the government, have for whether you have a college that is worthy of being stamped as accredited. That was a battle that went on within the Adventist Church in the 20s and on into the 30s. And one of the people who worked very, very hard to make sure that the Adventist Church, in fact, was committed to seeking accreditation, conforming to the laws of the land, was Percy McGann, an immigrant from Ireland who became a Seventh-day Adventist. He became an Adventist minister. He taught at Emmanuel Missionary College, and that was the place where people who were loyal to the church and didn't stay with John Harvey Kellogg, that's where they went. And Percy McGann appreciated Kellogg a great deal and the educators around Kellogg. But he went and became dean of Emmanuel Missionary College. He then went to Nashville, Tennessee, and established Madison College. While he was there, by the way, he was married to a woman who was a physician, and while he was there establishing Madison College in Nashville, Tennessee, he went to medical school, and at the age of 47, he received his MD degree. The church immediately took this person and made him dean of the medical school. And for 27 years, he was here at what is now Loma Linda University. Well, he had known Ellen White. He had known the leaders of the church. He had known John Harvey Kellogg, but he'd stayed with the denomination. And he was appalled at the idea that there was anybody in the church that would say, no, we shouldn't try to get our schools accredited. He felt that he was defending Ellen White's vision of reason being able to know the laws of nature, reason being able to know the laws of health, reason being able to develop skills in how to heal. And so in the 20s, he started really pushing the whole church to be committed to accreditation. Well, in 1928, finally, the church approved accreditation of colleges, but only junior colleges. I don't frankly know why just junior colleges. But in 1931, there was approval of senior colleges for accreditation. 4 years later, the General Conference and Annual Council decided, well, let's rescind that somewhat and have just 3 accredited colleges. Just 3. McGann was furious and beside himself. And so the next year that was rescinded, and very quickly Adventist colleges worked very, very hard to become accredited, and they have ever since. Now, I know I've been focusing on, structure and institutions and so on, but this was a commitment of the church knowingly to say, we are going to agree that we have minds and that we are beholden to God and to our vision of what God wants us to do for him in the world, to use our minds to learn about science and to learn about all the things that our society says are essential for an accredited education. And I hope you see that there's a link between this practical decision and a whole theological commitment to rationality and to the law. Here is McGann. I want to just quote this paragraph from McGann because it's his reflection on this period and what had happened. He says, if we had listened to the counsel of worldlings, and I think he means by that people who are not really committed to the principles of the Adventist Church. If we had listened to the counsel of worldlings, I do not suppose we ever would have started our schools, our sanitariums, our publishing houses, and our magnificent organizations and enterprises of this people, all of which have grown out of very feeble and very imperfect beginnings, started, however, in the fear and under the hand of a mighty God, according to the word of his servant, the prophet. Now, these people who are against accreditation said that they were the ones who were the true defenders of the Adventist faith, the true heirs of those early pioneers of the little flock. Here you have McGann, who is turning that right on its head and saying, those of us who are for accreditation, those of us who are for agreeing to learn principles of science and literature and so on, we're the ones that are defending the prophet. You got that? We're the ones who are doing that because she was committed to this whole understanding, this kind of expansive view of how God is not only the Savior, but also the creator of the creation. Now, at Loma Linda, among those people who are teaching religion for years now, since soon after the Second World War, certainly by the 70s, there has been a consistent appreciation of how our reason as human beings is expected to look out on God's creation and learn from the laws of science, the laws of society, the entire laws of God's creation. And I have sometimes called this the wisdom tradition in Adventism that is flourishing and has been flourishing here at Loma Linda. Two of the people who, from the 70s on, really emphasized this was Dr. Jack Provancha, a physician and also a theologian who came here to teach for many years, and then Graham Maxwell, the son of Arthur Maxwell, Uncle Arthur, who wrote the stories for children and the Bible story, and also an editor of the Signs of the Times for many years. They agreed on a kind of appreciation of reason and the ability of reason to look at the Bible, to look at creation, and that there was a continuity between what we see in nature and what we see in the Bible. So that scientific knowledge was a way to seek the knowledge about God. For Provencher and Maxwell, the quest for knowledge in science was very closely integrated with the quest for knowledge about God. He says, this is Maxwell, who wanted us to trust that God was a reasonable God, not a God of vengeance, but a God who was reasonable and who lived according to the highest moral standards. He says God invites us to trust him. He's not asking us to take a chance, to risk a leap in the dark, nor is he expecting us to accept mere claims or trust some inner feeling or some sign or miracle that Satan could counterfeit. God is simply asking that we consider the evidence so readily available. So you see that his description of the life of faith is very much like the life of the scientist. It is to look at the evidence reasonably and come to reasonable conclusions. And he even takes that to understand what is happening with the sanctuary, the extension of time, so that the second coming has not arrived yet. And he says what is happening is that there are all these unfallen worlds with unfallen beings, and they are looking at the evidence as to whether God is merciful or not. And so the extension of time is an extension of the time of what is basically a huge jury of process, with the unfallen worlds as the people who are evaluating what God is doing. The sanctuary is not so much just us being on trial, but it's really God that's being on trial. And but we are looking at the evidence as to whether God is in fact merciful and reliable. Jack Provencher talked about laws, and he says God is God whose law can, quote, can aid uncertain trust. That is, law as a disclosure of the way things really are. And he means by that the law of the Ten Commandments, but he also means law that we find in creation. He says it is hard to imagine one more foundational thought to Adventism than the doctrine of creation. You see how I've been talking about creation as a doctrine and the whole concept and metaphor of law as being central to one aspect of Adventism. And then they use that to understand health, right? And here are examples of people that in the latter part of the 20th century emphasize that. And he says, Ellen White had much to say that was critical of drug therapy, but she also was in favor of medicines. Not at the very beginning, where she wanted to rely on miracles, but later. And he says, the Creator can be at work in the scientist's laboratory. Now, since then, I won't go into the specific people, but there are another generation of teachers here at Loma Linda that have emphasized how we have to have a reasonable faith. We have to have a faith that looks at revelation, and it also looks at creation. And that God is a God of salvation and a God of creation. And law is a way to describe the continuities of all of this. So I think that we've spent enough time, perhaps, underscoring this, and I wanted you to know that in this tradition, the place probably where it is most alive and where people are thinking about it is in fact Loma Linda University, which is, of course, a healthcare institution. And I would think in your work, you would want to think about health in terms that we did at the very beginning, which was the dominant view in the years of ferment, namely the body is the temple of God, and we want to be purified so that we are a cleansed temple, and our bodies are cleansed so that we can appear before the holy God. You also want to consider the idea of health understood as law, as something that can be understood, that can be grasped if we use our reason, and it is also something that we can lay out to other people and help them to understand. So we'll close now, and the next time we'll start in on understanding health as a part of a conflict between good and evil, or at least a struggle, or at least a process. But this kind of a much larger view of good and evil, it is in fact understanding health in the midst of Ellen White's understanding of the conflict of the ages, the great controversy. See you next time. Thanks.